Hey everyone, ready to explore something kind of cool.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Today, we're going to tackle those sneaky negative thought patterns we all deal with.
The ones that can trip us up.
Right, like whether it's that big meeting coming up or just trying to, level up in life.
For sure.
Understanding these patterns can be a game changer.
Absolutely.
So we're diving deep into this piece called Seven Poor Thinking Patterns You Must Break.
Sounds interesting.
And the first one is something we've probably all experienced. It's called all or nothing thinking.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely been there.
Like when that one setback makes you feel like a total failure.
It's like your brain goes to extremes.
Right. No middle ground. It's either total success or utter disaster.
Exactly. You're either on top of the world or you're convinced you're completely incompetent. No in between.
Ouch. Yeah, that sounds familiar. It's like after a bad date, you start thinking, well, that's it. I'm going to be alone forever.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Or if you miss a deadline at work, you think, oh, no, I'm going to get fired.
Totally. So it's like one isolated event, and suddenly you're painting this whole dramatic picture of your entire life.
And that's the trap of all or nothing thinking. It can really distort your perspective.
So how do we escape that trap? How do we reprogram that all or nothing code?
First, you got to catch yourself in the act right. Notice those extreme thoughts when they pop up.
So like hit the pause button on the mental drama.
Yeah, and then ask yourself, hold on, is this really true? Is this one thing really defining my entire worth?
So injecting a dose of reality.
Right. Then you can start to see the shades of gray.
Instead of I'm a failure, it becomes, okay, this one thing didn't go as planned, but I've also had successes.
Exactly. You zoom out and see the bigger picture.
Not letting one tree block the whole forest.
I like that. And that actually leads us perfectly into the next negative thinking pattern.
Oh, which is?
Which is overgeneralization, where you take that one bad apple and assume the whole bunch is spoiled.
Like that one bad date making you think all dates will be bad.
Exactly. I actually had something similar happen with car mechanics.
Oh, really?
Yeah, had one bad experience, and for years I avoided mechanics altogether, convinced they were all out to get me.
Wow, so you took that one negative experience and applied it as a universal truth.
It's so easy to do, right? Our brains just love finding patterns.
Even if they're not really there.
Yeah. But the thing is, just because something happened once doesn't mean it'll always happen that way.
Okay, so how do we break free from this always and never thinking?
Well, instead of assuming all mechanics are bad, I eventually started asking friends for recommendations.
So you replace that sweeping statement with specific evidence.
Yeah. You gather those clues like a detective.
I like that. Speaking of focusing on specifics, let's talk about the next sneaky thinking pattern. Mental filtering.
This one's interesting.
What is mental filtering?
Imagine you're at a party and you overhear one tiny criticism about your outfit.
Oh.
And then you spend the rest of the night obsessing over that one comment.
Completely ignoring all the compliments you probably got.
Exactly. It's like you have this mental spotlight that only shines on the negative stuff.
Leaving all the good stuff in the dark.
Right. So how do we switch off that harsh spotlight and see the full picture?
That's a great question.
One powerful tool is keeping a gratitude journal.
Interesting.
Instead of dwelling on the negative, you actively notice and appreciate the good things in your life.
So intentionally shifting our focus.
Exactly. Training your brain to see the positives.
Makes sense. And this ties into the next pattern we're going to discuss. Disqualifying the positive.
Where you downplay your accomplishments.
So while mental filtering makes us focus on the negative, this one makes us minimize the positive.
Exactly. Like, let's say you get a promotion at work.
That's awesome.
But instead of celebrating, you think, oh, it was just luck, or anyone could have done it.
Wow. So you're basically refusing to take credit for your own win.
Right. And it often comes from things like imposter syndrome, that feeling of not being good enough no matter what.
So how do we combat this self-sabotaging tendency?
Well, it starts with noticing when you're doing it. Then challenge those thoughts.
So like ask yourself, is there really no other reason for my success other than pure luck?
Yes. Don't be afraid to own your achievements. You deserve to feel proud.
I love that. It's like giving ourselves permission to celebrate those wins, big or small.
Exactly. And sometimes while we're busy disqualifying the positive, we're also jumping to conclusions about negative stuff.
Jumping to conclusions, that's a classic.
Right. Like when you don't hear back from a friend and immediately assume they're mad at you.
Happens all the time.
We fill in the blanks with our own assumptions, creating all this worry and stress.
So how do we avoid those mental leaps of doom?
Simple. Get more information. Instead of assuming, call your friend or send a follow-up text.
So replace assumptions with facts. Don't jump to conclusions. Investigate.
Exactly. And while jumping to conclusions can make us anxious, catastrophizing takes it to a whole new level.
Uh-oh, catastrophizing. That sounds intense.
It is. It's like you make one small mistake at work, and your mind goes, oh no, I'm going to get fired. I'll lose my house and end up living under a bridge.
Whoa, talk about a worst-case scenario.
Right. It's like one tiny misstep triggers a disaster movie in your head.
So how do we calm down that inner drama queen and get back to reality?
Well, you can challenge those catastrophic thoughts. Ask yourself, what's the most likely outcome here? Is it really as bad as I'm imagining?
So separate what's possible from what's probable.
Exactly. And sometimes those catastrophic thoughts are fueled by our emotions, which brings us to our next pattern, emotional reasoning.
Ooh, this one sounds tricky. What's the connection between our emotions and our thoughts?
Well, emotional reasoning tricks us into believing that our feelings are facts.
So, like, if you're feeling anxious, you assume something bad is definitely going to happen, even if there's no proof.
Exactly. You let your anxiety dictate your reality.
So, like, if you're nervous about a presentation, you just assume you're going to bomb it, even if you've practiced.
That's a perfect example. So how do we separate our feelings from the facts? How do we stop letting our emotions run the show?
Yeah, how do we do that?
Well, first you got to recognize that feelings are temporary. They don't always reflect the truth.
So just because you feel anxious doesn't mean you are going to fail.
Exactly. You acknowledge the feeling, but you don't let it define you.
Okay, that makes sense. Is there anything else we can do?
Yeah. Ask yourself, what's the evidence for this thought? Is there another way to look at this situation?
So, like, putting those emotion-based thoughts on trial, demanding evidence.
I like that. And that's a key part of cognitive therapy, this idea that our thoughts influence our feelings and behaviors.
Right. Okay, so we've explored all 7 of these sneaky thinking patterns, but how do we actually change them? Where do we even begin?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and we'll dive into some powerful techniques for rewiring our thinking in part 2 of our deep dive. But before we get there, let's take a moment to reflect.
Sounds good. I'm ready for a mental break.
Me too. So you remember Richard, right?
Yeah, you mentioned him earlier.
He was a high achiever, always pushing himself to be the best, but that came with a constant inner critic.
Always second-guessing himself.
Exactly. And it really got to him,
So, like, he was stuck in that all-or-nothing thinking. One mistake, and he was a total failure.
Totally. It was exhausting for him.
Yeah.
Always stressed, never feeling good enough.
So how did he break free? What tools helped him rewire that thinking?
Well, one powerful technique is called cognitive restructuring.
Cognitive restructuring. Okay, that sounds kind of complicated.
It's actually pretty simple.
So how does it work?
It's like putting your negative thoughts on trial.
Okay.
First, you got to pinpoint the thought that's causing you trouble.
Got it.
Then you play both sides. Prosecutor and defense attorney. You gather evidence for and against the thought. You ask, is this really true? Is there another way to see this?
So instead of just accepting those negative thoughts, we're challenging them.
Exactly. You're putting them under the microscope.
I like that analogy. So what happens next? What's the verdict?
Well, then you get to be the judge. You weigh the evidence and decide, is this negative thought justified?
Or is it based on, like, faulty assumptions?
Right. You replace those distorted thoughts with more balanced ones.
So it's like reframing the story we're telling ourselves.
Exactly. And the more you do this, the better you get at spotting those negative patterns.
It's like a mental workout, building those mental muscles.
Totally. And Richard actually used this technique to overcome his all-or-nothing thinking.
Oh, so...
He realized that one mistake at work didn't make him a failure. Everyone makes mistakes.
Right. It's about seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. But cognitive restructuring isn't the only tool we have.
What else is there?
Mindfulness. It's become a bit of a buzzword,
Yeah.
but it's incredibly helpful.
Okay, I've heard of mindfulness, but I'm not really sure what it is. How does it actually work?
Well, it's about paying attention to the present moment.
The present moment.
Yeah, your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations.
Yeah.
Just noticing them without judgment.
So, like, taking a step back from all the mental chatter.
Yeah, it's not about suppressing thoughts. It's about recognizing them and letting them go.
So creating some distance between ourselves and our thoughts.
Exactly. And a simple way to practice mindfulness is through breathing exercises.
Breathing exercises, like how?
Just take a few deep breaths. Focus on the air going in and out.
So it's like hitting the pause button on all the chaos.
Yeah, just being present in the moment.
Okay. And if you do this regularly, you start to gain more control over your thoughts.
Exactly. You become more aware.
So it's not just about calming the mind. It's about choosing which thoughts to engage with. That's pretty cool.
It is. And Richard found mindfulness really helpful for managing his anxiety.
Oh, really?
He started meditating regularly, and it made a big difference.
That's amazing. So it sounds like he used both cognitive restructuring and mindfulness.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that changing these thought patterns takes time.
It's not a quick fix.
Right. There will be times when you slip up.
So what's the best way to stay on track when that happens?
Be patient with yourself. Don't beat yourself up over setbacks.
Okay.
Just acknowledge them, learn from them, and keep going.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. And you don't have to do it alone.
Oh, right. Like therapy.
Yeah, therapists can teach you these techniques.
And there are support groups too, right?
Absolutely. You can connect with others who are going through the same thing.
That's a good point. It's okay to ask for help.
Exactly. So we've talked about these tools for rewiring our thinking. But what does it all mean for our listeners?
Yeah. How can they actually apply this stuff in their own lives?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is the power of self-awareness.
Self-awareness.
Yeah, just recognizing those negative patterns is a huge step.
It's like shining a light on them and saying, hey, I see you, and I'm not going to let you control me.
Exactly. Once you see them, you can choose different thoughts and actions.
So we're not just reacting emotionally. We're in control.
Right. And with practice, you can develop a more positive and resilient mindset.
That's empowering. But how do we actually put this into practice? What can our listeners do today to start rewiring their thinking? So it feels like we've uncovered this like hidden mental superpower, right?
Taking control of our thoughts.
But how do we make it a habit? How do we actually use it every day?
Well, it's about taking those small, consistent steps, like building any muscle,
Oh, right. So it's like mental fitness.
Exactly. You wouldn't expect to run a marathon after just one workout.
So what are some reps we can do for our minds?
Well, one simple one is to challenge those negative thoughts with evidence.
Evidence.
Yeah, like next time you think, I'm going to totally mess up this presentation, stop and ask yourself, wait, what evidence do I have for that? What's actually more likely to happen?
So we're gathering evidence to like build a case against our inner critic.
Exactly.
Love it. What else can we do?
You can also try reframing those negative thoughts, make them more positive or at least more neutral.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Instead of thinking, I'm so terrible at public speaking, try, I'm a little nervous, but I've prepared well and I'm going to do my best.
So it's about shifting the focus from our fears to what we can actually control.
Right. And remember those mindfulness techniques we talked about.
Yeah, the breathing exercises and stuff.
Even just a few minutes a day can make a big difference.
It's like a mental reset button.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And don't forget about the power of positive self-talk.
Oh, right. Instead of putting ourselves down, we can actually be our own cheerleaders.
Exactly. Treat yourself like you would a good friend.
That makes so much sense. And one last thing we haven't talked about yet is our environment.
Oh, yeah. Our surroundings can have a huge impact on our mindset.
So it's about creating a support system that lifts us up.
Exactly. Spend time with positive people who encourage you.
Makes sense. And of course, if those negative thought patterns feel really overwhelming, it's okay to ask for help.
Absolutely. A therapist can provide guidance and support.
It's a sign of strength to reach out for help when you need it.
So let's do a quick recap of what we've learned in this deep dive into negative thinking patterns.
Okay, sounds good.
We explored 7 common patterns, like all-or-nothing thinking and emotional reasoning that can really hold us back.
And we talked about practical ways to challenge those thoughts, like cognitive restructuring, mindfulness, positive self-talk, and surrounding ourselves with good vibes.
And of course, Richard's story shows us that change is totally possible.
It's inspiring to see how these techniques can work in real life.
Absolutely.
So what stands out to you as the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive?
For me, it's remembering that our thoughts aren't always facts.
Yeah, we talked about that.
They're just our interpretations, and we have the power to choose more helpful interpretations.
That's a great reminder.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, I have a question for our listeners.
Oh, what's that?
What's one small step you can take today to start challenging those negative thoughts and building a more positive mindset?
It could be anything, right? From noticing those all-or-nothing thoughts to trying a few minutes of mindfulness.
Exactly. Every little bit counts.
Well, that's a wrap on our deep dive into breaking free from negative thinking patterns.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights today and feel ready to start rewiring your thinking for a happier, more fulfilling life.
Remember, you have the power to create that positive change.
One thought at a time.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those minds sharp.
See you later, everyone.